Chapter 17. A year had passed since Elund had come into the service of Odin. He was a minor king in the lands southeast of Camelot, and southwest of Mercia. Odin may think he ruled, but Bayard held the lands, and those of Senird, in his grip. But this did not stop Odin having designs on Mercia, and marrying Innes had crystallized those ambitions. In his service, Elund had been treated well and had become anonymous. Odin, resisting her return to Mercia on Bayard's command, sensing it would be her death, and promoted her position within his household guard. "You fight well, you are reliable," he told Elund, after the rebuff. And Elund, as a led, was happy for the anonymity, fighting for Odin's interests and keeping his borders safe. However, the raids into Camelot did not sit well with her, and when it had come to pillaging, she had taken the role of guard of prisoners rather than despoiler of house and home. Particularly when the next village to raid was hers. "We go north," the guard captain Aldred told the band. "It is near harvest time." So they left the Roman city of Badon and marched towards Gloucester, where many Britons still lived, and followed the Hayfren River to their destination, crossing the border into Camelot. Though King Odin knew her as Elund, she was a led to the guards and warriors of Hicks. She was anonymous, hidden, banished now from 2 kingdoms. But she was happy in Badon. Innes, her half-sister, Elund supposed, seemed happy with Odin, and she herself got on with the guards. They were quick-witted, and brave despite so many being mercenaries, and they fought with heart and soul for Odin's money. "It is said that the Britons hate us," Elfrid, one of the other palace guards, commented. "It is said they invited us over to repel the Picts and gave us land," Aldred replied, as they camped beside the Hayfren. "And the Picts are very repulsive." The band of a dozen or so warriors laughed. Elund too. She was with kin, Saxons, never needing to worry about her Briton heritage, and could laugh and fight and drink with the best of them without question over divided loyalty. Except for that night. That night was the night before the morning before they would raid her village. Lancelot would take Elund to the place where she had been pulled from the river a little further up the valley. She was anxious. Away from the family who had brought her up, this warlord band was to ravage the village to strike fear, and raid the harvest for Odin's table. Elund had felt guilt for it in the other villages they had attacked, but this time, it was personal. 88,888,888. From the west rode Prince Arthur, several knights and Merlin, who had vowed to protect their villages from raiders. This one was no different, and they had decided that, to help the villagers, they would train a militia of men in the village. The elders of the village met with the prince and told him of their worries. "We need more protection. The plains south of us mean the Saxons can just ride in and take what they want. Food, grain, livestock," said the older man. "We do all the work and lose our harvest," said the other, Elund's uncle, Owain the Gwydir, and Lancelot's father. "We can no longer send your father tribute, sire. If we have nothing, then we will teach you to fight," Arthur decided. So the young men of the village turned out the next morning, and with hand picks and billhooks they formed lines and attacked the Camelot knights, learned to split lines to draw the enemy and how to strategically retreat. "They are inexperienced and underprepared," Sir Leon told them that evening, after they had feasted on pork cooked by Elund's aunt. A poor state indeed if they had to slaughter their animals, as this showed they had no spare food to keep their beasts alive over the coming winter. "Merlin, go and help the lady of the house Half, Elund's aunt supplied. Arthur smiled, and nodded. Half, in the kitchen. Merlin, inclined to grumble, but keeping it to himself, knowing what would come if he said anything to Arthur, a boot up the bottom or a clip round the ear. "No doubt. We will stay a little longer, before moving up to Henft," Arthur told them. The battle at Merlin's birth town showed how a trained population can hold up against the Saxon. He shook his head. "My father tried diplomacy, and we got the voracious Bayard. Odin in the south is worse. Lot will do all he can to attack west but hasn't the numbers, and fears Senird and Bayard. It is not a long-term strategy, but if we keep the Saxon interested in one another, they will be less likely to attack us." He put down his plate, nodding to Elund's aunt and thanking her for the food. "May I suggest, Sir Percival interjected as the conversation continued about strategy. As with Merlin's village and many others in Camelot, the reason so many have not done more to pursue martial means of protection is because there is, or there has been, another means of protection. Arthur paused in his drinking of his ale. "What do you suggest, Sir Percival?" Arthur demanded. "Spit it out." Sir Percival looked a little sheepish, but then put down his own tankard. "Magic, to be blunt, sire," he told them. "Many villages still have those with magical powers and who have relied on them to defend their villages. With your father's policy, you criticize my father's policy?" Arthur asked, getting to his feet. "No, sire," Percival added, hastily. "Absolutely not. I am saying that, before he introduced it, your father tolerated sorcery and witchcraft, and as such, those with magic supported their homes and families against attackers. By making those with magic leave, villages are, as you say, inexperienced and underprepared." Arthur stared at Percival for some time, and then glanced out of the window. He knew why his father persecuted those with magic, druids, sorcerers and so on, his own birth and his mother's background. It was well known Arthur had pursued Igraine and stolen her from her husband, who had had an unfortunate, terminal accident. His uncle, Igraine, was still bitter over this, despite declaring his support for Arthur and Camelot. Those with magic in Cornwall had risen up, and incited those in Camelot to do the same in protest, and that protest had been vigorously suppressed. "Then it is up to us to do something about it." "Merlin," Arthur called, "more wood for the fire, and help Half and Owain the widow with the sleeping arrangements. Sir Leon, arrange the watch. We will not be long to bed, for the Saxon like to raid at dawn." 88,888,888. A clash indeed came in the early hours, when a flash of steel erupted from undergrowth and made for the biggest house, for that was where the biggest grab could take place. The damp of the mist clung to everything as the Saxons moved in the early twilight. Coils of old fire smoke emanated from houses, making it easy to pick out. Aldred, their leader, had briefed the Saxon raiding party, for he had scouted the village a week before, and knew where the main bulk of the animals and grain were kept. They had come prepared with wagon and horse to take off the booty. Several older Saxon men, not brisk or agile enough now to fight, would return what they could grab and go south, back to Odin's lands. It was as they passed the turn of the brook that headed out towards the forest, where Lancelot had inadvertently trained Elund by fighting her for fun as a child, that her heart froze. This was her home, and while she felt comfortable and happy in the service of the warlord Odin, who was reasonable and fair, she could not, in faith, attack here. Instead, Elund felt a strong, protective pull of her childhood home on her heart, looking as she did now on homes whose inhabitants had been kind to her, had fed her, indulged and corrected her. No, she would not raid, and, instead of just sitting back and allowing the rest of her colleagues to do so, she devised a plan. Like all the other villages they had attacked, the people had come blinking out into the dawn unprepared and unwilling to fight. There was no protection. And so, if the barns could be opened, if the animal enclosures unbarred, they could take all that Aldred planned with minimal harm to the people. A bright light trickled across the ground as morning came into being. The raid began as they always did, by focusing on the spoils, and the men rounded on the barns and animal pens, which were open. No man need be roused through bloody might to open them for the raiders, and risk alerting others to the emergency. Instead, Hayard, Aldred's second-in-command, signaled to fill the hayricks with grain, and pens with the swine, and Elund put her hand on her uncle's door, the palm feeling warm under the wood as she did so. Many memories swept up through her fingers, days opening and closing it on her way to the meadow, on her way to the brook, all in Matthew's or Lancelot's company. In Elund's memory, it was high summer. Birds twittered and days were long with promise of festivities once harvest was gathered. Much as would have happened here, several weeks before. Her aunt and uncle would have led the action, Owain tending the fire that scorched the shrub, half making food that would be preserved for the winter, sharing the harvest with the villagers, hoping the winter would be mild and the weather turn to growth and warmth. A shout went up beyond her uncle's house. Smoke was rising from one of the buildings. It was that of the bishop, who was now being pulled out of his house, struggling in vain against the raiders. Aldred was directing him towards a stake that had been hurriedly erected, and now Dewey was being hauled onto it, ropes around his feet and ankles. In the months that had followed her expulsion from Mercia, Elund had become a shadow, selling her sword as a mercenary to Odin in exchange for her life, moving through the lawless borderlands with Odin's men. To all she was a lead, and to the villagers they encountered, the Saxon, the brutal warrior who haunted the woods, an unyielding machine of war who protected the weak but left no survivors among the cruel. A name that mothers would tell their children of to invoke fear. Elund had done things as cruel as they were doing now. But this was her home, and the mantle fell from her. This was her home, a broken bar. Already, those men of influence from the village were emerging in the half-light, hobbits, farming equipment held firmly in disorientated hands. Beside Dewey, two of Odin's men were dragging Owain the farmer, his place being set beside Dewey. Not here. Not amongst the people who had raised her. Elund had been expelled from Camelot, all for trying to do what was right, and banished from her father's kingdom for her very birthright. And now Odin, in whose kingdom she felt most at peace, had his warriors threatening her people. She charged at Hayard, at Aldred, who were singling out men and tying them to wooden pikes, whose lives were about to be ended after the threat had been made to extricate more from the village. They would be killed anyway. Elund attacked Osric and Deathwood, young guards at the end of the line of villagers, young guards though they were, but each with the might of a bull. They were not expecting her ferocity and stumbled back as when the farmer was forced to a stake. The old man stumbled and Elund caught his arm. Whether her turncoatedness had been noted, Elund neither knew or cared. She gripped her sword tightly as she tore across to her uncle, parrying one of the guards as she went, driving her sword not into the Britons but at their bonds. The four men, Uncle Owain included, set free. But Elund's actions were nothing compared to the energy that was happening behind her. A couple of the younger Saxon guards had noticed, but the ferocity of noise and call to line diminished all Elund had done. For a line being held by the villagers was coming towards the raiding Saxons, and they were not armed with billhooks and picks. They had swords. As Odin's mercenaries assembled, line to face line, Elund could see why. Knights, Camelot's knights in red robes, armored, walking amongst them bolstered their number. Arthur had early decided to garrison his borders and had sent a broken bar. The charge called by Aldred buried any sense of working out Elund's feelings about her family, about the prince who had taught them to defend themselves. Instead, she flowed into her warrior self, actions learned over years, muscles moving almost without thought. As she swept forward, armored Camelosian knights flooded the front line and she parried with one and then another as Osric and Aldred headed the Saxon line. On and on they fought, Elund's not registering the dead as more Saxon flooded forward, for the line was holding, to the astonishment of the Saxon, so used as they were for it to be a smash-and-grab raid. Two villagers fell at Elund's hand as she fought onward, willing the line to split so that the enemy would yield. Yet they fought on, and the number of the dead increased. Then she saw him, the man who hid his magic to the world. It was not he who called the wyvern into the battle, but someone on the Saxon side, for it was the creature of Summerseat, setting fire to the village houses more efficiently than ever Odin's band could have done. A lick of flame glanced down into the center of the battle, before the animal screeched and pulled out of the dip, banking into the air and cruising the micro-bursts of air turbulence. The line held by the villagers was buckling. A massive, scarred mercenary swinging a rusty mace smashed through a barn door, his eyes locked on a huddle of terrified children who were cowering at the back as the roof burned around them. Elund didn't hesitate. She threw herself into his path, her short blade burying the whistling chain with a jarring crack that vibrated through her teeth. Back. She spat, her voice a low, masculine bark, and she ducked under a second swing, the spiked ball shattering a wooden post inches from her head, and drove her shoulder into her supposed comrade's chest. He stumbled and Elund spun, her blade finding the gap in his leather armor, and he went down with a bloody gurgle. Run. to Owain Wigthwir. She forced the door open and pulled the eldest to it. They got the message and head off to her uncle's door. She swung back to the battle and found the wyvern was heading towards them. Two more closed into the gap that had not been created. This was going to be tough and bloody men would be lost. Elune shook her head to make her focus, and surged towards the fray. Arthur was 20 paces away, submerged in sea of steel, his cloak a flash of red against the mud, defending two older men who were being outmatched by two Saxons, one her captain, the other a stalwart of Odin's men. The killing blow almost came to both men when a cry from the heavens and a roar of rushing wings scored through the morning sky. All ducked as a tongue of flame licked the ground 100 feet away from them. A heartbeat, and then the battle continued. Merlin was here. Could he really have done this? Elune knew she must find him. Yet she was shoulder to shoulder deep in the fighting. She swept right, looking for an opening. Aeled, to your left. Osric's warning came just as a spear point whistled past her ear. Elune parried, pivoted and thrust backward, then struck, killing her master's enemy with economy and efficiency. She took a glancing blow from a mace to her shoulder, the impact dropping her to one knee, but she rolled through the pain, hamstringing her attacker as she rose. It was a brutal, ugly exchange, for she was mud and blood-soaked. Then turned. For Elune was of this village, and this village was being attacked by a mythical, magical creature. Out of the corner of her eye, Elune saw him, clearing a path for Arthur as he drove on. Merlin. But that the wyvern was attacking the Britons suggested it was not he who had called the beast into being. Who, then, of Odin's warriors was using magic? As Elune turned to stand with a group of Odin's elite, serrated blade caught her in the flank. She staggered forward and then saw the answer. It was Aldred. Aldred was mumbling something, his lips moving, and keeping eye contact with the wyvern. And she could see the trajectory. He was directing the wyvern to the center of the fighting, a broken bar he was directing the wyvern to. Arthur. Whatever drive Elune on despite the wound to her leg she could never recall or understand. She thrust herself forward and charged to him, screaming for all she was worth, and rounded on Aldred. The shock from the unexpected attack gave Elune enough time to gain the advantage and she capitalized on it, surging forward and thrusting the blade he had presented to her up and under his leather battle coat. A gurgle, and Aldred the Saxon was dead. But it hadn't stopped the wyvern. An ear-splitting screech caused the host to look up as it took another dive. Arthur was still its target. She ran, her momentum pushing away the prince as she turned, then held aloft her sword, swiping at the huge animal. Her damaged leg made her stumble and she thrust forward, striking at its cockerel-like talons and incising one deeply. The wyvern roared in pain and turned in its flight, sticking out its other leg and clenching its talons around her thorax and lifting her 6 feet off the ground before dropping her and recoiling into the bright, autumn skies. Elune staggered, and then collapsed into the arms of Percival, her strength finally failing. As her eyes closed, she saw Arthur's face, not on the battlefield but within the prison cell where his father had thrust him for acting with compassion to his servant. On the field, the Saxon mercenaries, seeing their leader fallen and the Prince of Camelot unyielding, finally broke. They vanished into the dark undergrowth of the forest, leaving behind only the groans of their own dying comrades. Elune closed her eyes and waited for death.